What do Zionism and nail polish remover have in common? To answer that, let's talk about the Balfour Declaration. How did a 117-word letter from a British foreign secretary empower a 3,000-year-old nation to return to their homeland? And what makes the Balfour Declaration so important and controversial still today, more than 100 years later? November 2nd, 1917. In the thick of World War I, as the British prepared for victory over the Ottoman Empire and the imminent quest of much of the Middle East, Foreign Secretary Lord Arthur James Balfour wrote an important letter to one of Britain's most illustrious Jewish citizens, Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild. In the letter, he expressed the British government's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This short letter would come to be known as the Balfour Declaration. We're going to see how this letter was carefully crafted, explore its deliberately ambiguous wording, and why it has been the topic of both inspiration and controversy, depending on who you ask. For many, the Balfour Declaration was the benchmark of international recognition of the Jewish right to the land of Israel. It was the first time in nearly 2,000 years that a great international power recognized the Jewish people were one nation entitled to their own land. And a few years later, after World War I, the new League of Nations, predecessor to the UN, accepted this recognition. International law now provided the Jewish people a legal right to self-determination in their homeland, something Jewish people around the world had been praying for almost 2,000 years. Others, however, viewed this as a presumptuous act of overpromising on the part of hasty British treaty makers. But let's jump back for a moment. Why was establishing a national home so important to begin with? For nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people scattered across the globe kept their dreams alive to return to their indigenous land, the land of Israel, or as the Romans had renamed it after exiling Jews, Palestina. For 2,000 years, the Jews prayed for their return to the land. They told the history of the land, they studied the civic, religious, and agricultural laws of the land, and had maintained a continuous presence in small communities throughout the land. And many Jews had returned throughout the centuries, from medieval rabbis like Judah Halevi and Nachmanides to the students of the leading 18th century scholar, the Vilna Gaon, to major waves of Jews fleeing persecution in 1881 and 1904. These latter 19th and early 20th century pioneers purchased acres of desolate swamps, desert, and soil neglected for centuries, working tirelessly to make them bloom. The prospect of international support for this cause was of utmost importance, and Herzl had desperately tried, in vain, to pitch Zionism to the Germans, the Ottomans, and the British. And though Herzl was convinced that his life's work was a failure, only 13 years after his death, the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917. But what led the European powers who had previously denied Herzl to finally approve a Jewish homeland? Well, in 1917, during World War I, as Britain was on the verge of defeating the Ottoman Turks, British leaders felt they could use a favorable boost of support. In addition to a genuine belief in the cause of Zionism, as we'll get to in a minute, Britain's leaders hoped that a statement in support of Zionism would help their cause in World War I for two primary reasons. One, the British needed help from the Russians, and knowing that many leaders of the Russian Revolution were Jewish, they hoped it would make Russia more pro-British. And two, the British hoped that supporting Zionism would help bring the Americans into the war as well. How, though? Well, the notion that Jews controlled world affairs was a well-known anti-Semitic trope, and the British weren't immune to it. But many Brits, such as Lord Balfour, also recognized the Jews' right to the land. Balfour believed that Jerusalem was more Jewish than London was British, or as Chaim Weizmann, Israel's future president, told him, "We had Jerusalem when London was just a marsh." Now, how did Chaim Weizmann come into the story? Well, Weizmann, a brilliant chemist and Zionist leader, had recently developed a new process of extracting acetone from chestnuts. What's so special about acetone? Aside from its use as nail polish remover, it was a key ingredient for the gunpowder the British Army needed in great supply. And up until the war in 1914, it was produced from minerals imported largely from Germany. But with Germany now their enemy, Britain had to find another source of large quantities of acetone and fast. Suddenly, Weizmann's revolutionary acetone production process was in high demand, and giving the British government the rights to its development without charge, Weizmann was soon appointed director of the British Royal Navy Laboratories. Weizmann's scientific impact and position in the military industry soon brought him into working relationships with senior administration officials in London, and he became close to a young Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, and David Lloyd George, then Minister of Munitions. Weizmann's practical nature, brilliant mind, and headstrong idealism also won the support of additional key British players: Lord Balfour, Home Secretary Herbert Samuel, and expert on Turkish affairs Sir Mark Sykes. In December 1916, Lloyd George became Prime Minister, and he named Arthur Balfour as his Foreign Secretary. Soon, the British Foreign Office sent a note to Lord Rothschild and his good friend Weizmann, requesting that they submit proposals for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This was pretty much the focus of their entire lives, so they were pretty stoked about the opportunity. In July 1917, Weizmann submitted his proposal. A few months later, the British government wrote and revised a few drafts of the declaration. Some Zionists were frustrated when the British used the phrase establishing a Jewish national homeland instead of reconstituting, which would imply they had a historical precedent for a national home there. But ultimately, it was a landmark achievement for the Zionists regardless, and the letter approved the promise the Zionist movement longed for: a recognition of the right of Jewish people to establish their national home in the land of Israel. Remember that term, a national home, because we'll come back to it later. The letter was addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild, who was then head of the English Zionist Federation. As we mentioned, in the letter, Balfour proclaimed His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And this wasn't all talk. Although there were 700,000 Arabs living there at the time, Balfour deeply believed in the values of Zionism, as it was rooted in age-long traditions and present needs. Present needs being rampant anti-Semitism, pogroms, and the impossible challenges Jews faced in Europe, and the age-long traditions referring to the Jewish people's 3,000 to 4,000 year history with the land of Israel. Now, in a broader context, with the end of the Ottoman Empire's control of the Middle East, vast areas of the region needed to be redefined, and in many cases, formed into distinct independent states. It had been 2,000 years since the region of Palestine had been ruled autonomously by its inhabitants, before the Jewish exile even began. Now, both Jews and Arabs laid claim to the land that they had both inhabited at different points in history. So, they were good to go. The British sent a clear message of their commitment to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, right? Not so fast. There were a few problems. First, it's an astonishingly ambiguous document. In its attempt to not overstep, or maybe to evade making an explicit commitment, the Balfour Declaration left itself unclear in a variety of ways. Though Lord Balfour privately assured the Zionist leaders that a Jewish national home meant a state, this is not what the document actually says. Rather, it said a national home for the Jewish people. No mention of a state. There was also no mention of when or how this national home would be created. Details that might have been important to include. The Declaration also stated that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. This could be a problem if most Arab leaders considered any national connection of the Jews to the land as an impingement on their rights. Perhaps most frustratingly, there was no clear definition of the maps themselves, no real indication what the Declaration meant by Palestine, which at that time included land that would later be lopped off by the British and established as the new Kingdom of Transjordan. Aside from wording ambiguities, there was a very different problem altogether. It seemed as though Britain had already promised the Promised Land, and not to the Jews. If you've seen Lawrence of Arabia, you know that back during World War I, in order to rally the Arabs against Ottoman rule, Sharif Hussein of Mecca was assured by the British that he would gain an independent Arab kingdom following defeat of the Ottoman Turks. And the vague area of land he was promised, from the Arab perspective, included Palestine. Right around the same time, Britain's Sir Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot developed a secret plan to split up the Middle East into an independent Arab state or confederation of Arab states. In the end, they chose the latter, creating Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and a bunch of other states. But according to this plan, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, most of Palestine would be under an international administration. Parts of it would be controlled by Great Britain, and none of it would be controlled by the Jews or the Arabs. So, when the Balfour Declaration was subsequently issued in 1917, the British were promising land that had already been spoken for. The Arab leaders rejected the Balfour Declaration as they would never feel comfortable with the Jewish people taking ownership of any of the land altogether. Arab opposition grew steadily and turned into large-scale violence as riots and massacres against the Jews erupted in the 1920s. In the 1930s, frequent riots rampaged throughout Palestine by both Arabs and Jews against each other and against the British, resulting in the Arab Revolt of 1936 through 39 and the Jewish Rebellion against the British Mandate in the 1940s. Later, this would lead to the 1948 War of Independence and the eventual establishment of the State of Israel. The story behind the Balfour Declaration is a complicated series of diplomatic twists and turns and an example of how this small piece of land can provoke so many arguments and controversies. But what stands out is that this declaration helped end 2,000 years of Jewish exile and November 2nd, 1917, is a day remembered by Jews around the world as representing international recognition of their rights as a people to their historic land. Thanks for watching. See you guys next week. Did you know that before there was an official Israeli army, there were actually 3 underground Jewish militias? Yeah, they were the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi. They all had competing ideologies, and sure, they fought common enemies like the British and the Arabs, but their fiercest enemies were often each other. Now, these fights between the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi weren't your family's Seder table squabbles. This was Jew against Jew with life and death consequences in the future Jewish state. By the way, we're talking about the period between the late 1930s and mid-1940s when Nazi Germany was taking over Europe and the number of Jewish victims continued to rise. But despite their disagreements, the Jews comprising these militias did all have something in common: Zionism. They were all desperate to achieve the dream of a Jewish state. Where they disagreed was on how to achieve the dream. So, who were these militias? Why did they briefly put aside their differences to join forces, and why did they ultimately disband? Now, to better understand the different powers in play prior to Israeli independence in 1948, let's briefly talk about Zionism, the movement to establish a Jewish state. Today, the word alone can send a room into a frenzy. That isn't a new phenomenon, even amongst fellow Zionists. But it's important to know that Zionism isn't and never has been monolithic. It has different flavors. Think of eating pizza. There's different ways to do it. You can pick it up, you can fold it, you can eat with a fork and knife, but at the end of the day, it's still eating pizza. So it's the same with Zionism. Different ideas, but still Zionism. But as an aside, if you eat pizza with a fork and knife, I think we need to talk. Anyway, these different strands of Zionism are what inspired the competing military factions we're going to talk about. We're gonna pick things up in the 1920s when we had Jews and Arabs living under British colonial control in modern-day Israel. Quick history lesson: what is now modern-day Israel was colonized by the British from 1923 to 1948. It was called the British Mandate of Palestine, or simply the British Mandate for our purposes. At the time, the mainstream strand of Zionism was socialist Zionism, whose followers believed that achieving a state would require working diplomatically with other countries, namely Great Britain. Sounds simple enough, right? David Ben-Gurion, the leader of mainstream Zionism and Israeli founding father, #NotJustAnAirport, and the overall establishment believed in this idea. But socialist Zionists were still realists and saw the value in having a military. So in 1921, in response to spreading Arab violence against Jews and the British Mandate, these social Zionists established the Haganah, an illegal underground army. I know, a legal underground army sounds pretty badass. But the Haganah was really established more out of necessity, simply to provide protection to Jewish settlements. It practiced a policy of havlaga, or restraint, and didn't go full paramilitary or launch attacks. A loose organization made up of local defense groups, Haganah leaders favored the long game of diplomacy with the British in hopes of eventually establishing a Jewish state. Fighters were instructed to only defend Jewish communities, not incite violence against the Arabs or the British. But some Haganah commanders protested this policy of restraint. I'm looking at you, Vladimir Jabotinsky. Basically, Jabotinsky, one of the Haganah's original leaders and founders, fathered a splinter movement from socialist Zionism known as revisionist Zionism that gained prominence in the latter half of the 1920s as Arab violence against the Jewish community picked up. Spurred on by Jabotinsky, these revisionist Zionists felt social Zionists were too weak and passive in the face of British rule and Arab oppression. After particularly bad bouts of Arab riots against Jewish settlements in 1929, 31, and 37, fed-up Haganah commanders, led by Jabotinsky, launched a rival militia called the Irgun, dedicated to armed struggle against the British and the Arabs. Not too long after, the British implemented something called the White Paper of 1939, which dictated their official government policy in the British Mandate. 1939, something else important happened that year? Anyone? Only the Second World War broke out. So just when things were getting really, really bad for the Jews in Europe, right when they needed to get out the most, the White Paper strictly limited Jewish immigration to the British Mandate. In doing so, the White Paper only exacerbated the divide between the Haganah and the Irgun. Now in theory, socialist and revisionist Zionists, the strands that made up the Haganah and the Irgun, weren't all that different. they actually agreed on quite a bit, including opposing everything about the white paper. Both believed in the establishment of Jewish settlements in pre-state Israel, the right to a Jewish armed forces, and more Jewish immigration, all accomplished ideally through diplomacy with the British. But where they disagreed was to what degree they might be willing to use force, if need be, to achieve those goals. But what did that look like? Well, with the Second World War raging in Europe, Ben-Gurion and the establishment pledged support to the British in their fight against a common enemy, the Nazis. They still favored the path of diplomacy, although they voiced their displeasure with the British policies like the White Paper. The Irgun, on the other hand, sneered at the Haganah philosophy of restraint. They continued fighting the British despite the war effort, taking their marching orders directly from Jabotinsky and eventually Menachem Begin, who arrived in the early 1940s. They intimidated merchants, extorted money, and even blew up British immigration and tax offices. Ben-Gurion reviled the Irgun, referring to its members as a harmful, destructive gang. He feared Irgun-led revolts would bring down the wrath of the European power on Jews in the British Mandate. Think the Irgun sounds intense? Well, meet the Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, and the third armed Zionist underground organization we'll talk about. Soon after the outbreak of the Second World War, the Irgun adopted a temporary truce with the British, essentially ending its violence against them. It was a move that, surprise, surprise, some Jews didn't like. So yet another splinter group took shape in 1940 when Abraham Stern, an Irgun commander, created the Lehi. The Lehi was a radical organization carrying out extreme operations, even political assassinations, against the British. Both the Irgun and the Lehi were motivated by the same thing, ripping up the white papers. In fact, Lehi was so desperate that early on during the Second World War, prior to the Nazi final solution, they actually attempted to coordinate with the fascist Italians and the Nazis to circumnavigate British limitations on Jewish immigration and get European Jews out safely. They actually viewed the Axis powers as lesser enemies than the British. Yeah, you heard that right. I mean, there's the whole my enemy's enemies thing, and then there's that. Think about that for a second. Some pre-state Zionists tried to coordinate with Hitler to save Jews. That's pretty crazy. No doubt, revolution in the face of a heavyweight colonial power is a messy, messy business. And just like the Haganah and the Irgun, the Lehi thought they were doing what needed to be done. However, the Lehi was seen by most Jews at the time as dangerous and illegitimate. Establishment figures, your Ben-Gurions, your Golda Meirs, with close ties to the British who had hopes of leveraging that relationship, viewed the Irgun and the Lehi as threats to diplomatic efforts. In fact, they thought the Haganah's two rival militias were so problematic that Meir proposed destroying them. Yeah, she actually said that, even adding that she had, quote, no moral constraints about the notion. When Ben-Gurion replied that they couldn't shoot Jews in the land of Israel, Golda Meir responded, quote, we have to do everything to make them stop in this work. Everything. Cutthroat, Golda. Cutthroat. And this wasn't just talk. In 1944, the Lehi's assassination of Lord Moyne, the British Minister of State in the Middle East and BFF with Winston Churchill, was the last straw. Between November 1944 and March 1945, with Ben-Gurion's approval, the Palmach, the Haganah's elite fighting unit, searched out members of the Irgun and the Lehi and handed them over to the British. This was known as the hunting season. Why? Well, when the Haganah arrested and turned in fellow Jews to the British, they knew full well they might be condemning them to the gallows. During the hunting season, Begin, now the undisputed Irgun leader after Jabotinsky's death in 1940, refused to fight against the Haganah, against fellow Jews, despite being targeted by them. Ben-Gurion and Meir weren't so idealistic. But then something changed. With the end of World War II in the fall of 1945, strict limits on Jewish immigration became something Zionist establishment figures like Ben-Gurion could no longer tolerate, and the British showed no signs of easing up. Sure, they never liked the white paper policies, but with the end of the Holocaust and so many Jewish refugees in post-war Europe needing a safe haven, abolishing limits on Jewish immigration to the British Mandate became paramount. Enough was finally enough. And so, with the three militias wanting to ensure unrestricted Jewish immigration to the British Mandate, their leaders took on Ma'avak, or the struggle. Now, this was no small feat. After all the friction and double-crossing between their ranks, the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi joined forces and put their differences aside to attack British infrastructure. Beginning in the fall of 1945, a remarkable show of unity amongst these armed Zionist organizations ensued, shedding light on the Zionist cause. Together, they formed Tnuat HaMeri HaIvri, which has been loosely translated as the United Resistance Movement. Let's call it the URM for short. Ben-Gurion and the Haganah had veto power over decisions and led many successful URM attacks on strategic points. This included sabotaging railway tracks, sinking British patrol ships, taking out radar installations used to detect the incoming flow of Jewish immigrants by sea, and isolating the British by blowing up bridges that connected the British mandate to neighboring Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. In response, the British unleashed Black Sabbath, a harrowing assault on Jewish communities and cities from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, in which citizens were placed on lockdown. More than 17,000 British soldiers searched for Zionist militants and confiscated important documents. Now, remember those documents. Amidst the turmoil, Chaim Weizmann, future first president of Israel, declared, "What did you expect? That you blow up trains and the British will give you honey cakes?" He demanded an end to the violent revolt against the British. Simultaneously, actual pogroms were still happening in post-war Europe. While Black Sabbath was happening in the British Mandate, 42 Jews were brutally murdered in a pogrom in Kielce, Poland. Despite the Holocaust being over, Jews still felt ignored, cornered, and feared they were running out of options. Worse still, they couldn't agree on the best course of action. Now, one course of action that Irgun leaders had discussed in years past was bombing the landmark King David Hotel in Jerusalem, home to the British headquarters in the area. They believed that striking such a main artery would deal a devastating blow to the British and further the Zionist cause. The Haganah had previously always nixed the idea, but after Black Sabbath, the Haganah gave its blessing. Why? Remember those documents the British confiscated during Black Sabbath? Well, Haganah leaders believed they contained incriminating evidence linking the likes of Ben-Gurion, Meir, and the Jewish agency to the Haganah, which was still illegal until 1948. Irgun leaders also feared that the documents could lead to retribution against their ranks. So the Irgun, with the stamp of approval from Moshe Sneh, the head of the Haganah, planned the bombing. Just 2 days before, the Haganah and the Lehi actually backed out, but the Irgun was undeterred and decided to go for it, ultimately planting bombs in the hotel's basement on July 22nd, 1946. Warning phone calls were placed to the hotel to try and allow occupants time to leave. But inexplicably, hotel guests were only warned about 25 minutes in advance. In the end, 91 people were killed in the attack. Ben-Gurion and the Haganah falsely denied any involvement. Meir expressed ostensibly genuine shock and remorse. Most reports indicate that she actually knew nothing about the planned attack prior. The bombing effectively ended the period of Zionist kumbaya and the URM. The loss of innocent life also highlighted the controversial tactics of the three joined militias. Shortly thereafter, they ceased working together, and the Irgun and the Lehi resumed their own operations in defiance of the Haganah. But let's not diminish the importance of what happened. For 10 months, pre-state Zionists rallied under one banner, something that seemed highly improbable before the end of the Second World War. This was a critical period, and it showed the British and the rest of the international community how much establishing a Jewish state meant to the Jewish people. After the Holocaust, when the world closed its doors to the Jews, they needed a safe haven, and that safe haven was Israel. This time of unity was a precursor to the unity that would be needed to fight the Arabs during the 1948 Israeli-Arab War. Despite all of the intense infighting, the questionable methods, the backstabbing, and betrayal, these pre-state militias were able to put aside their differences and fight together. The Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi all took the fight to the British. But you could argue that it was a dirty fight. Did obtaining the Zionist dream come at the expense of Jewish morals? And should out-and-out diplomacy have been given more of a chance? What do you think?
We're going to have to close in prayer here. I know we got guests coming and security we got to meet with. So we'll have prayer. Love to do a discussion, but we're early out of time. Hope you enjoyed it. It's pretty educational about how everything took place and how the British were their friends and their enemies at the same time. That's pretty good. Father, thank you